Hello, hello, hello. All right, let's get started. So OBGYN is a dual-faceted surgical specialty. GYN is short for gynecology, which focuses on the female reproductive system and organs, while obstetrics relates to the process of pregnancy and birth. Every unit, there will be new medical terminology that you need to learn, and so here are some common complications with the OBGYN unit. What is the difference between a colposcopy and a hysteroscopy? Both of them end in oscopy, which means we're going to be looking at them through a scope, but we are looking at different structures. It's another one of those situations where you could do a hysteroscopy on a patient and do an incidental colposcopy as well, but you can't do a colposcopy and also do an incidental hysteroscopy. Understand? Another common one is cystocele versus rectocele. They sound so different, right? So how can we get them confused? Well, both of them deal with the walls of the vagina. A cystocele deals with the anterior wall of the vagina, while the rectocele deals with the posterior wall of the vagina. Anterior is when the bladder herniates into the vagina. A posterior is when the wall between the vagina and rectum is weakened, leading to the rectum herniating into the vagina. You will hear this more often called an anterior-posterior repair, which is further shortened to A and P repair. But don't accidentally call it anatomy and physiology repair. That'd be silly. The different types of abortions can also get people tripped up. No, these are not voluntary abortions. These are the terms used to differentiate the specific developmental stage of pregnancy when a miscarriage occurs. You'll want to know the difference between them. How far along was the mother? Was the placenta retained? What are the procedures that go along with them? Another common one in obstetrics is nuchal cord versus cord prolapse. They both get confused because of that silly word cord, but they are absolutely not the same. And finally, placental abruption and placenta previa tend to do that same thing because they both deal with the placenta, but they too are different pathological events for our patients. Over the next couple of slides, we will cover the important anatomy of the pelvic organs. Remember, we're talking normal anatomy now, while surgery is done on abnormal anatomy or structures. First, it's important to keep in mind that the uterus resides in the anterior portion of the pelvic cavity. What anatomical structure can you think of from our previous units that lives posterior to the female uterus? I'm waiting. Did you say sigmoid colon? If so, you're right. The two structures live very close to one another, making both of them a major concern for either specialty. Another thing to keep in mind is the proximity of the uterus to the bladder. The bladder lies within the inferior wall of the pelvic cavity. Think about that previous sentence carefully. The bladder organ lives immediately under the bottommost wall of the pelvic cavity. Because these three structures, the sigmoid colon, uterus, and bladder, all live so closely to one another and all have external anatomical considerations, you and your expanding brain need to imagine the anatomy in its actual state, which is not two-dimensional like in your text, but rather it's three-dimensional inside the person. Do you see what I mean? This is what it will look like when you're actually involved in a surgical procedure in a female pelvis. Can you begin to appreciate the complexity of the anatomy and how fascinating it is? That's one of the many reasons I love being a surgical tech. I'm just fascinated by the human body, and getting to participate in all kinds of procedures is so interesting. And you see this space right here, right there? That tissue between the uterus and the bladder is a shared fold of peritoneum that creates a pouch. In its normal state, this pouch is called a cul-de-sac. During hysterectomies, the surgeon must dissect the shared fold of peritoneum so they can remove the uterus but leave the bladder. At this point, the anatomy takes on a new name, the bladder flap. You'll hear physicians refer to the bladder flap when they're dissecting the uterus free, but when they're performing a procedure that does not require removing the uterus, like an oophorectomy, they'll likely evaluate this region while they're there. At this time, the tissue is called the cul-de-sac. So, when I ask you next Thursday, when is the tissue called a cul-de-sac and when is it called the bladder flap, I want you to be able to tell me. Otherwise, you might want to use this for one of your I don't get it moments. Finally, the uterus is made up of 3 portions. Those 3 main portions are the fundus, the body, and the cervix. The fundus and body are separated by an imaginary line created by the insertion site of the fallopian tubes into the uterus on each side. So right about there, all right? The body is the middle portion. It's important because that's where the implantation and development of the embryo takes place. Finally comes the third section, the cervix. Many students don't quite grasp that it's an integral part of the anatomy of the uterus, but it is the part that communicates with the vagina. Without a cervix, there is no natural means for a fetus to be born. That's pretty important, don't you think? So remember, there's 3 portions of the uterus, and each one has a specific job to do. One receives the egg, one implants the egg, and one delivers the baby. Within the cervix, there are 2 openings, which are named the internal os and the external os. The internal os is located in the innermost portion of the cervix, where the uterus opens into the cervix. The external os is where the outermost portion of the cervix opens into the vagina. These ora are what we must dilate during positive feedback during labor to facilitate childbirth, and it's what will manually dilate during surgery within the uterus from the vaginal approach. Okay? The uterus is nifty because it's suspended in the pelvic cavity by a complex set of uterine ligaments. These ligaments position the uterus in that anterior slope and support it while it houses a developing baby. This image shows you the 4 paired uterine ligaments. Got that? 4 paired uterine ligaments. They are the round, the broad, the cardinal, and the uterosacral ligaments. The round ligaments live near the fallopian tubes, and it gives the uterus that primary anterior suspension support. They can stretch and spasm during pregnancy, which can give a false sense of labor pains. They are the first ligaments to be ligated during an abdominal hysterectomy. Adversely, they are the last ligament to be ligated during a vaginal hysterectomy. Can you tell me why that is? The broad ligaments are actually wide folds of peritoneum that attach the sides of the uterus to the pelvic wall. They are ligated in a various amount of numbers depending on the breadth of the ligament in each individual person and their personal anatomy. Sometimes one person's broad ligament is able to be ligated in one fell swoop, while others require 4 or 5 attempts to completely ligate it. The cardinal ligaments are found below the broad ligaments and provide the primary support of the uterus. Finally, the uterosacral ligaments, which are found along the lower curve of the uterus, attach the uterus to the sacrum, which is a part of the spine, and that helps keep the uterus suspended off the bladder. This final ligament, the uterosacral, is important when it comes to uterosacral ligament suspension, which can be added to a hysterectomy procedure to give the patient bladder support post-operatively.